The wind was howling at 35 miles per hour across the Afghan mountains. The target was barely visible through the scope, a mere speck against the rocky terrain 3,000 meters away. Most snipers would have packed up and waited for better conditions. Most snipers weren't Sarah Chun. As she steadied her breathing and felt the familiar weight of the rifle against her shoulder, Sarah knew that everyone back at base was watching. The same people who had whispered behind her back for months. The same officers who had questioned whether a 5 feet 4 inches woman from a small farming town in Iowa had what it takes to be among the military's elite marksmen. The same teammates who had placed bets on when she would wash out of the program. But in this moment, with a terrorist leader in her crosshairs and innocent lives hanging in the balance, none of that mattered. What mattered was the shot. The impossible shot that would either make her legend or break her career forever. This is the true story of how one woman defied every expectation, shattered every stereotype, and proved that sometimes the most unlikely heroes create the most extraordinary moments. It's a story about precision under pressure, courage in the face of doubt, and the split-second decision that changed everything. The countdown had begun. 3,000 meters. One shot. Zero margin for error. Sarah Chun grew up in the kind of small Iowa town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and dreams rarely stretched beyond the cornfields that surrounded them on all sides. Her father, David Chun, ran the local hardware store that his own father had started in 1952, and her mother, Linda, taught third grade at the elementary school where Sarah herself had once sat in those same small plastic chairs, staring out windows at endless rows of crops swaying in the prairie wind. The Chun family had always been different in Millbrook, Iowa. David's grandparents had immigrated from China in the early 1900s, making the Chuns one of only 3 Asian families in the entire county. Growing up, Sarah often felt the weight of being different, of standing out in a sea of blonde hair and blue eyes. She was quieter than most kids, more observant, always watching and listening rather than being the center of attention. But there was something about Sarah that even her parents didn't fully understand. While other kids her age were playing with dolls or video games, Sarah was fascinated by precision, by the idea that something could be done perfectly if you just focus hard enough and practice long enough. She would spend hours in the backyard, throwing rocks at tin cans her father had set up on fence posts, adjusting her stance, and grip until she could hit them consistently from increasingly longer distances. Her uncle Mike, her mother's younger brother, had served in Marines during the Gulf War, and he was the one who first noticed Sarah's unusual focus and steady hands. During family barbecues, while the adults talked politics and weather, Mike would watch Sarah practice with her slingshot, hitting targets that seemed impossibly small from distances that impressed even him. He had seen natural marksmen before during his military service, but there was something special about the way Sarah approached each shot with methodical precision. When Sarah turned 14, Uncle Mike surprised her with something that would change her life forever, a .22 caliber rifle and an invitation to join him at the local shooting range. Her parents were hesitant at first. Guns weren't common in their household, and they worried about their quiet, studious daughter getting involved with something they didn't fully understand. But Mike convinced them that learning proper firearm safety and marksmanship could be valuable skills, and more importantly, he saw something in Sarah that needed nurturing. The first time Sarah held a real rifle, she felt a connection she had never experienced before. The weight of the weapon in her hands, the importance of every small adjustment, the absolute requirement for mental discipline, it all clicked into place like pieces of a puzzle she had been trying to solve her entire life. When she fired her first shot and hit the center of the target at 100 yards, the range officer looked twice at the target, then at the small teenage girl, then back at the target again. Mike knew immediately that he was witnessing something extraordinary. Over the next 4 years, he became Sarah's mentor, teacher, and biggest supporter. Every weekend, they would drive to the range, and Sarah would practice for hours. She learned about wind compensation, bullet drop, breathing techniques, and the mental game that separated good shooters from exceptional ones. She studied ballistics like other kids study for math tests, reading military manuals and technical guides that most adults would find dry and complicated. By her senior year in high school, Sarah had won every local and regional shooting competition within a 300-mile radius. She had earned a reputation as the quiet girl who never missed, and colleges began offering her shooting scholarships. But Sarah had bigger dreams than college competitions. She had been reading about military snipers, about the elite men and women who serve their country with precision and honor, and she knew that was her calling. Her parents were terrified when she announced her intention to join the military after graduation. They had hoped she would use her shooting skills to earn a college degree. The idea of their daughter in combat situations halfway around the world was almost too much to bear. But Sarah had made up her mind with the same quiet determination she brought to everything else in her life. The conversation with her parents lasted for weeks. They would sit around the kitchen table after dinner, her mother's eyes red from crying, her father trying to understand how his gentle, bookish daughter had decided to become a soldier. Sarah tried to explain that this wasn't about violence or aggression, but about service and the opportunity to use her unique talents to protect others. She talked about precision, about discipline, about the honor of serving something bigger than herself. Uncle Mike supported her decision completely. He had seen her talent develop over the years, and he knew she had the potential to be something special in the military. He helped her understand what military life would be like, the challenges she would face as a woman in a male-dominated field, and the level of commitment required to succeed. He also helped her parent understand that Sarah wasn't just chasing a dream. She was following a calling that had been evident since she was a child. The day Sarah left for basic training was one of the hardest days of her life. Her entire extended family gathered at the hardware store, the same building where her great-grandfather had first established the family business. Her grandmother, who rarely spoke English anymore, took Sarah's hands in hers and spoke in Mandarin, words that Sarah's father later translated as a blessing for safety and success in the path she had chosen. As the bus pulled away from Millbrook, Sarah looked back at the town where she had grown up, at the cornfields and the grain elevator and the water tower with Home of the Panthers painted in fading blue letters. She knew she was leaving behind everything familiar and safe, heading toward a future that most people in her town couldn't even imagine. But she also knew, with the same certainty she felt when lining up a perfect shot, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Basic training at Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. The physical demands were intense, but manageable for someone who had spent years developing discipline and mental toughness. The real challenge came from the social dynamics, the constant need to prove herself in an environment where many of her fellow recruits and some of the drill instructors questioned whether women belonged in combat roles. Sarah's quiet nature, which had served her well in small-town Iowa, became both an asset and a liability in the military environment. She didn't engage in the loud boasting or aggressive posturing that many of her male counterparts used to establish dominance. Instead, she focused on excelling in every task, meeting every standard, and proving through performance rather than words that she belonged there. During weapons training, Sarah's exceptional marksmanship skills became impossible to ignore. While other recruits struggled to qualify with basic military rifles, Sarah was hitting targets with precision that impressed even the most skeptical instructors. Word began to spread through the training battalion about the quiet girl from Iowa who never missed what she was aiming at. But recognition came with a price. Some of her fellow recruits resented the attention Sarah received for her shooting abilities, and they began to question whether her success was due to skill or just luck. They would make comments about how shooting targets was different from shooting at people who were shooting back, how marksmanship competitions were nothing like real combat situations. Sarah absorbed these criticisms without responding, but they cut deeper than she let on. She began to doubt herself, wondering if the confidence she had built up over years of competition was just naive optimism. Maybe the critics were right. Maybe her small-town shooting skills wouldn't translate to military effectiveness. Maybe she was fooling herself about her potential to serve at the highest levels. The turning point came during a field exercise in the 8th week of basic training. The recruits were participating in a simulated combat scenario, working in teams to complete objectives while under pressure from drill instructors playing the role of enemy forces. Sarah's team was assigned to provide overwatch for another squad attempting to cross a river, and she was positioned with a rifle to cover their movement. When the exercise began, everything went wrong almost immediately. The crossing team came under heavy, simulated fire and became pinned down in the middle of the river. The drill instructors were using paint markers to simulate incoming rounds, and several members of the crossing team had already been marked as casualties. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and the team leaders were struggling to adapt to the changing conditions. From her overwatch position, Sarah could see the entire battlefield. She identified the positions where the drill instructors were set up, calculated the distances and angles, and began methodically engaging each target. Her shots were precise and quick, eliminating the simulated threats in a sequence that allowed the crossing team to reach safety. The exercise that had been headed toward complete failure suddenly became a textbook example of how supporting fire could change the outcome of a tactical situation. After the exercise, the drill instructors gathered around Sarah with expressions of surprise and respect. They had seen many recruits with good marksmanship scores, but few who could apply those skills effectively under the pressure and confusion of a tactical scenario. One of the senior instructors, Sergeant Martinez, pulled Sarah aside and told her something that would stick with her for the rest of her military career. "Chun," he said, "I've been training recruits for 12 years, and I've seen a lot of kids who could shoot holes in paper. But what you did out there today, that's different. You didn't just shoot targets, you solved problems. You saw the whole battlefield and figure out how to change the outcome. That's not something we can teach. That's something you either have or you don't." The recognition from Sergeant Martinez and the other instructors began to change how Sarah's fellow recruits viewed her. The quiet girl from Iowa who had seemed like an outsider became someone they wanted on their team. They began asking her for advice about shooting techniques and seeking her input during tactical planning exercises. Sarah discovered that respect in the military was earned through competence and reliability, qualities she had been developing her entire life. As basic training neared its end, Sarah faced the biggest decision of her young military career. Several instructors had recommended her for advanced training programs, including sniper school, which was considered one of the most elite and challenging specialties in the military. The opportunity was exactly what she had dreamed of since first learning about military snipers, but it also represented a commitment to a level of service that would be demanding beyond anything she had ever experienced. The United States Army Sniper School at Fort Benning, Georgia, had a reputation that preceded it by decades. It was where the military's most elite marksmen were forged, where only the most dedicated and talented soldiers earned the right to call themselves snipers. The course had a failure rate that hovered around 60%, and those who did graduate were considered among the finest precision shooters in the world. When Sarah arrived at Fort Benning in the summer of 2018, she was one of only 3 women in a class of 42 students. The other 2 women were experienced soldiers with years of combat experience, while Sarah was still relatively new to military life. She could feel the weight of expectations and doubts from her fellow students, instructors, and even herself as she prepared to begin the most challenging training of her life. The first phase of sniper school focused on fieldcraft, the art of moving unseen through hostile territory and establishing concealed shooting positions. Students learned to construct ghillie suits, elaborate camouflage garments covered in natural materials that could make a person invisible in the right terrain. They practiced moving silently through forests, across open ground, and up steep hills while carrying heavy equipment and maintaining absolute stealth. For Sarah, who had grown up in the flat, open farmland of Iowa, the dense Georgia forest presented unique challenges. She had to learn to read terrain differently, to use shadows and vegetation in ways she had never needed before. The physical demands were intense, crawling for miles through thick underbrush while carrying a rifle, ammunition, and survival gear that together weighed more than 60 pounds. The other students, particularly some of the more experienced soldiers, watched Sarah struggle with the initial fieldcraft exercises. They whispered among themselves about whether she had the physical strength and mental toughness to complete the course. Some placed informal bets on when she would voluntarily withdraw or be removed from the program. But Sarah had learned something important during basic training about perseverance and gradual improvement. Instead of becoming discouraged by her early difficulties, she treated each challenge as a problem to be solved through careful analysis and dedicated practice. She stayed after formal training hours to work on her camouflage techniques, studied topographical maps until she could read terrain like a book, and pushed her physical conditioning beyond what the course required. Slowly, her performance began to improve. She developed an intuitive understanding of how to move through different types of terrain, how to select firing positions that provided both concealment and clear fields of fire. Her small size, which some had seen as a disadvantage, actually became an asset in certain situations where larger soldiers couldn't fit into optimal positions. The breakthrough moment came during a field exercise in the third week of training. Students were required to establish a concealed position within 200 meters of a target area and remain undetected for 24 hours while observing and reporting on simulated enemy activities. It was one of the most challenging tests of fieldcraft skills, requiring students to balance the competing demands of maintaining observation, staying hidden, and surviving in the field with minimal supplies. Sarah spent hours studying the assigned area, using satellite imagery and topographical maps to identify potential positions. While other students focused on obvious features like rock outcroppings or dense tree lines, Sarah noticed a subtle depression in the ground created by seasonal water runoff. It was barely visible from most angles, but it offered a clear view of the target area while providing natural concealment. She established her position before dawn, carefully constructing a hide site that blended perfectly with the surrounding terrain. Throughout the long day, she observed and recorded the activities of instructors playing the role of enemy forces, noting patterns in their movements and identifying key leaders and equipment. When darkness fell, she remained motionless in her position, fighting fatigue and discomfort while maintaining her watch. The exercise concluded the following morning when instructors attempted to locate the students' positions. One by one, they found and eliminated students whose concealment had been inadequate or who had made small mistakes that revealed their locations. Sarah watched through her scope as more than half her classmates were discovered and removed from the exercise. When a lead instructor, Master Sergeant Williams, finally approached Sarah's position, he walked within 10 feet of her hide site without detecting her presence. He stood there for several minutes, scanning the area with binoculars and occasionally looking directly at the spot where Sarah lay motionless beneath her carefully constructed camouflage. Finally, he called out to the apparently empty landscape. "Whoever's out here, you win. I can't find you. Show yourself." Sarah slowly emerged from her position, rising from the ground like a ghost materializing from the earth itself. Master Sergeant Williams, a 20-year veteran who had trained hundreds of snipers, stared at her in amazement. Her camouflage was so effective that even knowing where she was, he had difficulty seeing her until she began moving. "Chun," he said, shaking his head in admiration, "that's some of the best fieldcraft I've seen in 15 years of running these exercises. You didn't just hide, you became part of the terrain." The successful completion of the fieldcraft phase marked a turning point in how Sarah's fellow students viewed her. The quiet farm girl from Iowa had proven that she possessed skills that couldn't be taught in any manual or classroom. She had demonstrated the patience, attention to detail, and tactical intelligence that separated true snipers from merely good shooters. The second phase of training focused on advanced marksmanship, taking students beyond basic shooting skills into the complex science of long-range precision shooting. They learned about external ballistics, the behavior of bullets over extended distances, and how factors like wind, temperature, humidity, and altitude could affect point of impact. They studied different types of ammunition, scope adjustments, and the mathematical calculations required to hit targets at ranges that most people couldn't even see clearly. This was where Sarah's natural talents and years of dedicated practice truly shone. While other students struggled to master the technical aspects of long-range shooting, Sarah absorbed the information like she had been waiting her entire life to learn it. She understood intuitively how environmental conditions affected bullet flight, and she could make the rapid mental calculations required to adjust for changing conditions. The instructors began using Sarah's targets as examples for the rest of the class. Her shot groups were consistently tight, her adjustments were precise, and her ability to engage multiple targets quickly while maintaining accuracy was exceptional. She wasn't just keeping up with the best shooters in the class, she was beginning to surpass them. But success in marksmanship brought new challenges. Some of her fellow students, particularly those who had initially dismissed her capabilities, began to resent her obvious talents. They suggested that her success was due to luck, or that shooting stationary targets on a controlled range was different from real-world applications. A few even implied that the instructors were giving her special treatment because she was a woman. The criticism stung, but Sarah had learned from her Uncle Mike years earlier that excellence sometimes creates enemies among those who can't achieve the same level of performance. She focused on her training, continued to improve her skills, and tried to prove through consistent performance that her success was based on hard work and natural ability. The situation came to a head during a stress fire exercise designed to test students' ability to perform under psychological pressure. Students were required to engage multiple targets at varying distances while instructors created distractions through loud noises, time pressure, and verbal harassment. It was meant to simulate the stress of combat situations where perfect shooting conditions don't exist. Several students who had been critical of Sarah's previous success seemed to take particular pleasure in her stress fire test. They gathered around the firing line, making comments about how this would separate the real shooters from the lucky ones. The pressure was intense, but Sarah had been dealing with doubters and critics her entire life. When her turn came, Sarah approached the firing line with the same calm focus she had developed during years of competition shooting. The instructors began their harassment immediately, shouting instructions, setting off noisemakers, and creating a chaotic environment designed to break concentration. Through it all, Sarah maintained her breathing rhythm, made her calculations, and engaged each target with methodical precision. When the exercise was complete, the results spoke for themselves. Sarah had achieved a perfect score, hitting every target in the center ring despite the distractions and pressure. Her performance was so exceptional that the lead instructor called a halt to the exercise and gathered the entire class around her target to examine the results. "This," Master Sergeant Williams announced to the class, "is what we're trying to teach you. This is what it means to maintain discipline under pressure. This is how a professional sniper performs when everything around them is falling apart." The perfect stress fire score marked the end of any serious questioning of Sarah's abilities among her fellow students. Those who had been skeptical were forced to acknowledge that her success wasn't luck or favoritism, but the result of exceptional skill and mental discipline. The students who had initially placed bets on her failure became some of her strongest supporters, recognizing that they were witnessing something special. As the course progressed into its final phase, which focused on advanced tactics and mission planning, Sarah continued to excel. She demonstrated not just individual shooting skills, but the ability to work as part of a sniper team, to analyze complex tactical situations, and to make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between mission success and failure. The final exercise was a comprehensive field problem that combined all elements of sniper training into a realistic scenario. Students worked in pairs, with one serving as the shooter and the other as the spotter, to complete a series of challenging missions over several days in the Georgia wilderness. They had to navigate to target areas, establish concealed positions, gather intelligence, and engage specific targets while avoiding detection by opposing forces. Sarah was paired with Jackson Martinez, a seasoned sergeant from Texas who had initially been among her strongest critics, but had become one of her most reliable teammates. Together, they represented an interesting combination of natural talent and experienced leadership, and their partnership worked better than either had expected. Their first mission required them to infiltrate an area controlled by opposing forces, identify a high-value target, and eliminate him without being detected. The target area was heavily patrolled, and there were multiple decoy positions designed to confuse students and force them into making hasty decisions. Sarah and Martinez spent hours studying the area, identifying patrol patterns and potential firing positions. When they finally selected their hide site, it was in a location that other teams had overlooked, a position that required a difficult approach but offered perfect concealment and a clear field of fire. The shot, when it came, was at a distance of 800 meters in challenging wind conditions. Sarah made her calculations, adjusted for environmental factors, and delivered a perfect hit that eliminated the target without revealing their position. Their extraction from the area was flawless, and they completed the mission without being detected by any of the opposing forces. Over the next 3 days, Sarah and Martinez completed 4 more complex missions, each presenting different challenges and requiring different skills. Their performance was so consistently excellent that the instructors began using their operations as examples for future classes. When sniper school concluded 8 weeks later, Sarah graduated at the top of her class with scores that set new records in several categories. She had not only proven that she belonged among the military's elite marksmen, but had established herself as one of the finest snipers the school had ever produced. The same instructors who had initially questioned whether a young woman from Iowa could handle the demands of the course now spoke of her as a future legend in the sniper community. 6 months after graduating from sniper school, Sarah found herself boarding a transport plane bound for Afghanistan, her stomach churning with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety that she had never experienced before. All the training in the world couldn't fully prepare someone for the reality of combat deployment. And despite her exceptional performance in training, she was acutely aware that she was about to face challenges that would test everything she had learned. Forward Operating Base Chapman was located in the Paktia province of eastern Afghanistan, a mountainous region that had seen intense fighting for years. The base served as a hub for operations targeting Taliban and al-Qaeda forces that used the rugged terrain to hide and plan attacks against coalition forces and Afghan civilians. It was exactly the kind of environment where precision marksmen could make a significant difference, but it was also unforgiving territory where small mistakes could have deadly consequences. Sarah's arrival at FOB Chapman created quite a stir among the soldiers already stationed there. Word had spread through military networks about the young female sniper who had set records at Fort Benning, and many were curious to see if her reputation was justified. Some were supportive and welcoming, eager to have such a skilled marksman on their team. Others were skeptical, wondering if someone so young and untested would be able to handle the psychological pressures of combat. Her new unit was the 1st Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, an elite infantry unit known for conducting some of the most dangerous missions in Afghanistan. The Rangers were experienced, battle-hardened soldiers who had been deployed multiple times and had earned their reputation through years of successful operations. For Sarah, joining this unit represented both an incredible honor and an enormous challenge. Captain Michael Torres, the company commander, was a veteran of 4 previous deployments who had seen many soldiers arrive with high expectations only to struggle when faced with the reality of combat. He was initially cautious about how to integrate Sarah into his unit, not because he doubted her shooting abilities, but because he understood that being a successful sniper in combat required much more than just marksmanship skills. "Chun," he told her during their first meeting, "I've read your files, and your shooting scores are impressive. But out here, we're not dealing with stationary targets on a controlled range. We're dealing with people who are trying to kill us in terrain that's constantly changing, under conditions that can go from calm to chaotic in seconds. Your training has prepared you for a lot, but combat will teach you things that no school can. Sarah appreciated his honesty and directness. She had always preferred straightforward communication to false encouragement, and she understood that earning respect in a combat unit would require proving herself under the most demanding conditions possible. She was assigned to work with Staff Sergeant David Kim, an experienced sniper who would serve as her mentor during her first deployment. Sergeant Kim was a second-generation Korean-American from Los Angeles who had been deployed to Afghanistan 3 times previously. He had earned a reputation as one of the most reliable and skilled snipers in the regiment, and he was known for his ability to train younger soldiers effectively. The pairing was intentional. Captain Torres wanted Sarah to learn from someone who could provide both technical expertise and combat wisdom. The first few weeks of deployment were devoted to familiarization missions, operations designed to help new arrivals understand the local terrain, enemy tactics, and operational procedures. Sarah accompanied experienced teams on patrol, observing how they moved through the mountainous terrain, how they communicated with each other, and how they adapted to constantly changing tactical situations. During these early missions, Sarah noticed that the other soldiers were watching her carefully, evaluating not just her technical skills, but her mental toughness and reliability under stress. She understood that she was being tested in ways that had nothing to do with shooting accuracy, and that her performance during these initial operations would determine how she would be used in future missions. The first real test came during a patrol in the Spin Boldak region, an area known for frequent Taliban activity. Intelligence reports had indicated that a group of insurgents was using a specific valley to move weapons and supplies, and the patrol was tasked with establishing observation posts to gather information about their activities. Sarah and Sergeant Kim were assigned to establish an overwatch position on a ridgeline that provided clear visibility into the valley below. The position required a difficult nighttime approach through rocky terrain, and they had to establish their hide site before dawn to avoid being detected by local civilians who might report their presence to insurgent forces. The climb to the ridgeline was more challenging than anything Sarah had experienced during training. The terrain was steep and unstable, with loose rocks that could create noise or cause falls if not navigated carefully. She was carrying her rifle, ammunition, communication equipment, and survival gear, a load that weighed nearly 70 pounds, and made every step require careful planning. Sergeant Kim led the way, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had made similar climbs many times before. He occasionally stopped to point out hazards or to show Sarah techniques for moving silently over difficult ground. His instruction was patient but demanding, and he made it clear that developing these skills quickly was essential for survival in this environment. They reached their assigned position just as the first hints of dawn began to appear over the mountains to the east. Working quickly but carefully, they established a concealed observation post that provided excellent visibility while keeping them hidden from anyone in the valley below. Sarah was amazed by how effectively they had managed to disappear into the landscape, using natural features and carefully placed camouflage to become virtually invisible. As the sun rose and the valley came to life, Sarah got her first real look at the area they would be observing for the next 12 hours. It was beautiful in a harsh, austere way, with steep mountains rising on all sides and a small stream winding through the valley floor. But she could also see why it was tactically significant, with multiple routes that could be used to move equipment undetected, and terrain features that provided natural concealment for anyone who understood how to use them. Throughout the long day, Sarah and Sergeant Kim observed the normal rhythm of life in the remote valley. They watched shepherds leading their flocks to water, children playing near the stream, and farmers working their small plots of land. It was a peaceful scene that made it hard to believe they were in one of the most dangerous regions of Afghanistan. But as afternoon turned to evening, their patience was rewarded. A group of men began moving down one of the mountain trails, carrying what appeared to be weapons and equipment. Sarah counted 8 individuals, noting their movement patterns and the care they took to avoid being seen from certain angles. These were not farmers or shepherds going about their daily business. Sergeant Kim confirmed the sighting and began calling in the information to their command post. The suspected insurgents were moving toward a cluster of buildings at the far end of the valley, and their route would bring them within range of Sarah's position. For the first time since arriving in Afghanistan, she might be called upon to engage real enemies rather than training targets. The radio crackled with instructions from their commander. The suspected insurgents were to be observed and tracked, but not engaged unless they presented an immediate threat to coalition forces or civilians. The priority was gathering intelligence about their activities and identifying their leadership structure. As Sarah watched the group through her scope, she felt a strange mixture of nervousness and focus that she had never experienced before. These were real people in her crosshairs, not paper targets or training scenarios. Everything she had learned about the technical aspects of sniping remained the same, but the psychological dimension was entirely different. The group eventually reached the buildings and disappeared inside, ending the immediate observation opportunity. But the mission had served its purpose, providing valuable intelligence about insurgent movement patterns and confirming that the valley was being used for military purposes. More importantly for Sarah, it had given her first taste of real-world sniper operations. During the long descent from their observation post that night, Sergeant Kim shared some thoughts about the mental challenges of sniper work that couldn't be taught in any classroom. He talked about the weight of responsibility that came with the ability to take life at long distance, the importance of absolute certainty before taking any shot, and the need to maintain emotional balance in situations where split-second decisions could have enormous consequences. The technical stuff you've already mastered, he told her as they picked their way carefully down the rocky slope. Your shooting skills are as good as anyone I've worked with. But the hard part isn't hitting the target. It's knowing when to shoot and when not to shoot. It's living with the decisions you make out here and understanding that every shot you take or don't take affects real people's lives. Sarah absorbed this wisdom while navigating the treacherous terrain, understanding that she was receiving insights that could only come from someone who had faced these challenges many times before. She was grateful to have such an experienced mentor, and she recognized that technical proficiency was only part of what made an effective combat sniper. Over the following weeks, Sarah participated in numerous patrols and observation missions, gradually building experience and confidence in the combat environment. She learned to read the subtle signs that indicated potential threats, to communicate effectively with her teammates under stressful conditions, and to maintain focus during long periods of boredom punctuated by moments of intense activity. But despite her growing experience and obvious competence, some members of the unit continued to question whether she was ready for the most demanding missions. They argued that she hadn't been tested under fire, that all her training and early missions had been relatively safe operations that didn't truly test her ability to perform when lives were on the line. These doubts came to a head during a briefing for a high-risk mission to capture a Taliban commander who had been responsible for several attacks against coalition forces. The operation would require precision shooting in a complex urban environment, with significant risk of civilian casualties if anything went wrong. Several experienced snipers were being considered for the mission, and Sarah's inclusion was being debated. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, the battalion commander, was torn between Sarah's obvious technical skills and concerns about her limited combat experience. He had seen many promising soldiers struggle during their first real firefight, and he understood that the consequences of failure on this particular mission would be severe. Chen's shooting scores are the best I've ever seen, he told his staff during the mission planning session. But scores don't tell us how she'll react when people are shooting back, when there are civilians in the area, when everything that can go wrong does go wrong. This mission doesn't have room for someone who might freeze up at the critical moment. Captain Torres argued strongly for Sarah's inclusion, pointing out that her performance during training and her early combat missions had been flawless. He noted that every soldier had to have a first time under fire, and that Sarah's preparation and mental discipline made her as ready as anyone could be. The debate continued for hours, with experienced officers weighing the risks and benefits of including an untested sniper on such a critical mission. Some argued that her inclusion would be unfair to the other soldiers whose lives might depend on her performance. Others maintained that her skills were too valuable to waste on less important operations. Finally, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes made his decision. Sarah would be included in the mission, but in a secondary role that would allow her to contribute while minimizing the risks if she struggled under fire. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but it gave Sarah the opportunity to prove herself in the most demanding circumstances she had yet faced. The mission briefing was scheduled for the following morning, and Sarah spent the night before checking and rechecking her equipment, reviewing the target area maps, and mentally preparing for what would likely be the most important operation of her military career. She understood that her performance would determine not just the success of this particular mission, but her future role in the unit and her development as a combat sniper. The mission briefing began at 0500 hours in the Tactical Operations Center, a dimly lit room filled with maps, satellite imagery, and communication equipment. Sarah sat among 12 other soldiers, all experienced rangers who had participated in dozens of similar operations. She could feel the weight of their attention as Lieutenant Colonel Hayes outlined the objectives and challenges they would face. The target was Hassan Mahmoud, a Taliban commander responsible for coordinating attacks that had killed 6 coalition soldiers and dozens of Afghan civilians over the past 3 months. Intelligence sources had pinpointed his location to a compound in the village of Khalid, a remote settlement nestled in a valley surrounded by steep mountains. The compound was heavily defended, and Mahmoud was known to use civilians as human shields, making the operation extremely complex and dangerous. This isn't going to be a standard capture mission, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes explained, pointing to the satellite images displayed on the large screen. The compound is in the middle of a populated area, with schools and markets nearby. Mahmoud has at least 15 fighters with him, and they've had months to prepare defensive positions. We need to get in fast, grab him, and get out before they can organize effective resistance. The plan called for a multi-pronged assault, with ground teams approaching from 3 directions while helicopter gunships provided overhead support. Sarah and 2 other snipers would establish overwatch positions on the surrounding ridgelines, providing precision fire support and ensuring that enemy fighters couldn't escape or reinforce their positions. Sarah's assigned position was on the northern ridge, approximately 1,200 meters from the target compound. It was the most distant of the 3 sniper positions, but it also provided the best fields of fire and the greatest tactical flexibility. Working with Sergeant Kim as her spotter, she would be responsible for covering the main approach route and eliminating any threats that emerged from the compound. Captain Torres pulled Sarah aside after the briefing to give her final instructions and encouragement. "This is what you've trained for your entire career," he told her. "Everything else has been preparation for moments like this. Trust your training, trust your instincts, and trust your partner. Kim knows what he's doing, and he'll help you make the right decisions out there." The insertion was scheduled for sunset, when the changing light conditions would make it easier to approach the target area undetected. Sarah spent the afternoon in final preparation, cleaning her rifle, checking her ammunition, and reviewing the terrain features and potential targets she might encounter. She had memorized every detail of the compound layout, identified key buildings and defensive positions, and planned multiple scenarios based on different ways the operation might unfold. As the sun began to set behind the western mountains, the assault team loaded onto helicopters for the flight to the target area. Sarah sat quietly during the 20-minute flight, controlling her breathing and visualizing the mission ahead. She had done this dozens of times during training, but never when the stakes were so high or when so many variables were beyond her control. The helicopter dropped Sarah and Sergeant Kim at a landing zone approximately 2 kilometers from their assigned position. They had 30 minutes to reach the ridgeline and establish their hide site before the ground assault began. The approach required climbing nearly 800 feet of elevation through rocky terrain in near-complete darkness, carrying all their equipment while maintaining absolute silence. Sergeant Kim led the way using night vision goggles, picking a route that avoided the most treacherous sections while still maintaining the speed necessary to reach their position on schedule. Sarah followed closely, trusting his experience while focusing on maintaining her footing and protecting her rifle from damage during the difficult climb. They reached their assigned position with 5 minutes to spare before the scheduled start time. Working quickly and quietly, they established a concealed firing position that provided excellent visibility of the target area, while keeping them hidden from observation. Sarah set up her rifle and scope, checked her range cards and wind readings, and confirmed her communication links with the other team members. Through her scope, Sarah could see the compound clearly despite the darkness. Infrared technology allowed her to identify heat signatures moving around the buildings, and she began counting enemy fighters and noting their positions. She could see at least 12 individuals, more than intelligence reports had suggested, and they appear to be alert and prepared for possible attack. "Control, this is Overwatch North," Sergeant Kim reported over the radio. "We're in position and ready. I count 12 to 15 enemy personnel, heavily armed, showing high alert posture. Recommend proceeding with caution." The response came back immediately. "Roger, Overwatch North. Ground teams are beginning their approach. Stand by for further instructions." Sarah settled in behind her rifle and began the mental process of preparing for combat. She reviewed her target priorities, checked her equipment one final time, and focused on controlling her breathing and heart rate. Everything she had learned during years of training was about to be tested in the most demanding circumstances possible. The ground assault began at exactly 2,100 hours with a coordinated movement by 3 teams approaching the compound from different directions. Sarah watched through her scope as the Rangers moved through the darkness, using cover and concealment to get as close as possible before being detected. The plan called for surprise and overwhelming speed to minimize the enemy's ability to organize resistance. For the first 10 minutes, everything went according to plan. The assault teams reached their positions without being detected, and they were preparing to breach the compound walls when everything changed in an instant. A sentry who had been hidden in a rooftop position spotted one of the approaching teams and opened fire, immediately alerting every fighter in the compound. The quiet night exploded into chaos as automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions around the compound. Sarah could see muzzle flashes through her scope as enemy fighters took positions in windows and doorways, firing at the approaching Rangers. The carefully planned assault had become a desperate firefight, with both sides seeking cover and trying to gain tactical advantage. "Overwatch North, we need immediate fire support," came the urgent radio call from the ground team leader. "We're taking heavy fire from the northeast corner building. Can you engage?" Sarah quickly identified the target building and spotted several muzzle flashes coming from second-story windows. The range was 1,180 meters, well within her capabilities, but the targets were partially concealed and moving between firing positions. She would have to time her shots perfectly to catch the enemy fighters when they exposed themselves to fire. "I have eyes on target," Sarah reported, settling into her shooting position. "Stand by for engagement." Her first shot came during a brief lull in the enemy fire when one of the fighters leaned out of a window to acquire a target. The bullet traveled across the valley in less than 2 seconds, striking the enemy fighter's center mass and eliminating the threat immediately. It was Sarah's first combat kill, but there was no time to dwell on the significance of the moment. Within seconds, another fighter appeared in a different window, and Sarah engaged him with equal precision. Her shots were having an immediate impact on the battle, forcing the enemy fighters to seek better cover and reducing the volume of fire directed at the assault teams. But the enemy adapted quickly to the sniper threat. Instead of exposing themselves in windows, they began firing from positions deeper inside the buildings, making precision shots much more difficult. Sarah found herself engaging targets at extreme angles, trying to hit fighters who were barely visible through doorways and interior windows. The battle continued for nearly an hour, with both sides seeking advantage in a deadly game of positioning and firepower. Sarah engaged multiple targets, providing critical support that allowed the assault teams to advance and eventually breach the compound walls. Her shooting was precise and effective, but the enemy's defensive positions were well prepared and heavily fortified. As the Rangers fought their way into the compound, the situation became increasingly complex. Enemy fighters were moving between buildings, civilians were caught in the crossfire, and the darkness made target identification extremely challenging. Sarah found herself in situations where she had clear shots at potential targets, but couldn't be certain whether they were enemy fighters or innocent civilians. Overwatch North, we have multiple personnel moving in the southwest courtyard, came another radio call. Can you identify if they're hostile? Sarah adjusted her scope and focused on the area in question. Through the infrared technology, she could see several figures moving between buildings, but their identities weren't immediately clear. Some appeared to be carrying weapons, but others might have been civilians trying to escape the fighting. This was exactly the kind of situation that Sergeant Kim had warned her about, where technical shooting skills were less important than judgment and decision-making. Sarah took her time to observe the group carefully, looking for definitive signs that would confirm whether they were combatants or non-combatants. After several tense minutes, one of the figures raised what was clearly an AK-47 rifle and began firing at the Rangers. That positive identification allowed Sarah to engage, and she quickly eliminated the threat while continuing to monitor the other individuals in the area. The critical moment of the entire operation came when the assault teams located Hassan Mahmoud in the main building of the compound. He was heavily guarded and had positioned himself in a room that provided excellent cover from ground-level attack. The Rangers were taking casualties trying to reach him, and the situation was deteriorating rapidly. All Overwatch positions, this is ground team leader, came the urgent radio transmission. We need immediate support on the main building. Target is in the second-story northwest room, but we can't get a clear approach. Can any sniper position engage? Sarah studied the main building through her scope, looking for any angle that might allow her to engage the target. The northwest room was partially visible from her position, but the angle was extreme and the range was at the very limit of what she could achieve reliably. The shot would require compensating for wind, elevation, and the acute angle of engagement. Overwatch North can see the target area, Sarah reported, but it's a very difficult shot. Range is 1,340 meters, wind is variable, and the angle is approximately 15 degrees downward. Sergeant Kim helped her analyze the shot, providing wind readings and confirming the range calculations. Together, they determined that the shot was technically possible, but would require perfect execution under extremely challenging conditions. One mistake could result in missing the target entirely, or worse, hitting innocent civilians in nearby rooms. Take the shot if you're confident, came the response from the ground team leader. We're running out of options down here. Sarah made her final calculations and settled into her firing position. She controlled her breathing, focused on her sight picture, and waited for the perfect moment when all the variables aligned. Through her scope, she could see movement in the target room, and she identified what appeared to be Hassan Mahmoud giving instructions to his fighters. The shot, when it came, was the result of years of training and months of combat experience coming together in a single moment of perfect precision. Sarah squeezed the trigger during her natural respiratory pause, and the bullet traveled nearly 1,350 meters through variable wind conditions to strike its target with devastating accuracy. Target down, Sarah reported, watching through her scope as the enemy resistance in the compound began to collapse. Hassan Mahmoud is eliminated. The successful engagement of the high-value target marked the turning point of the entire operation. With their leader eliminated and their defensive positions compromised by precision fire from the Overwatch positions, the remaining enemy fighters began to surrender or flee. The Rangers were able to secure the compound and complete their mission with minimal additional casualties. As the sun rose over the Afghan mountains the following morning, Sarah found herself part of a debriefing session that would be studied by military tacticians for years to come. Her performance during the operation had been nothing short of exceptional, demonstrating not just technical shooting skills, but the judgment and composure required of elite military snipers. 3 months after the successful Khalid operation, Sarah had earned a reputation throughout the coalition forces as one of the most reliable and skilled snipers in Afghanistan. Her performance during that first major combat mission had silenced the doubters and established her as a critical asset for high-risk operations. She had participated in 17 more missions, each one adding to her experience and confidence in the most challenging combat environment imaginable. But nothing could have prepared her for the intelligence briefing that came on a cold February morning in 2019. The target was Khalid Rahman, a senior al-Qaeda operative who had been responsible for planning attacks across multiple countries and had evaded capture for more than 5 years. Intelligence sources had finally pinpointed his location to a remote mountain stronghold in the Tora Bora region, the same area where Osama bin Laden had once hidden from coalition forces. The intelligence was time-sensitive and fragmentary. Rahman was meeting with other terrorist leaders to plan what intelligence analysts believed would be a major attack against civilian targets in Europe. The meeting was scheduled to last only 24 hours, and the remote location made a conventional assault extremely difficult and risky. Colonel Patricia Martinez, the task force commander, outlined the challenges during the mission briefing. The target location is at an elevation of 12,000 feet, accessible only by helicopter or a 3-day climb through some of the most difficult terrain in Afghanistan. Rahman has chosen this location specifically because it's almost impossible to approach without being detected, and he has security teams positioned at every possible approach route. The compound itself was built into the side of a mountain, using natural rock formations for protection and concealment. It could only be observed from a few specific locations, all of which were at extreme ranges that pushed the limits of even the most advanced sniper rifles and scopes. The nearest observation position we can reach is on a ridge approximately 3,000 meters from the target location, Colonel Martinez continued. That's beyond the effective range of most sniper systems, and the environmental conditions at that altitude make accurate shooting extremely challenging. Sarah studied the topographical maps and satellite imagery with growing fascination rather than concern. The shot would be at the absolute limit of what was technically possible, requiring perfect conditions and flawless execution. But as she analyzed the geometry and calculated the ballistics, she began to believe it might be achievable with the right equipment and preparation. The weapon selected for the mission was a .338 Lapua Magnum rifle, one of the most advanced long-range precision systems available to military snipers. With specialized ammunition and optimal conditions, the rifle was theoretically capable of engaging targets at distances exceeding 3,000 meters. But theory and practical application were very different things, especially in the thin air and unpredictable weather conditions of high-altitude mountain warfare. Sarah would be working with Master Sergeant Tom Bradley, a veteran spotter who had been deployed to Afghanistan 6 times and had experience with extreme long-range shooting. Bradley was initially skeptical about the feasibility of the shot, but he had worked with Sarah on several previous missions and had come to respect her ability to achieve what others considered impossible. "Chun, I've seen you do some incredible shooting," Bradley told her during their equipment preparation, "but 3,000 meters is a different world. At that range, everything matters. Temperature, humidity, wind speed, and direction at multiple altitudes, the rotation of the Earth, even the specific batch of ammunition can affect point of impact. We'll need perfect conditions and a lot of luck." The insertion was planned for the night before the terrorist meeting was scheduled to take place. Sarah and Bradley would be helicoptered to a landing zone 8 kilometers from their observation position. Then, make a difficult approach through mountain terrain while carrying specialized equipment that weighed nearly 100 pounds between them. The helicopter flight to the insertion point took them over some of the most spectacular and forbidding terrain in Afghanistan. Towering peaks rose on all sides, their snow-covered slopes glowing pale blue in the moonlight. Sarah could see why this region had been chosen as a refuge by generations of fighters who wanted to avoid detection and pursuit. The landing zone was a small, relatively flat area on a ridge line that provided access to their target observation position. As the helicopter settled onto the rocky ground, Sarah and Bradley quickly unloaded their equipment and moved away from the aircraft. Within minutes, the helicopter had disappeared into the darkness, leaving them alone in one of the most remote and dangerous places on Earth. The approach to their firing position took nearly 6 hours through terrain that was both treacherous and exhausting. They climbed over loose rock slides, traversed narrow ledges with 1,000-foot drops, and navigated through areas where a single misstep could result in serious injury or death. The thin air at high altitude made every step an effort, and the weight of their specialized equipment made the journey even more demanding. They reached their designated position just as dawn was breaking over the eastern peaks. The view was breathtaking, with mountain ranges stretching to the horizon in every direction. But Sarah's attention was focused on the target area, a cluster of buildings barely visible through high-powered optics at a distance that seemed almost impossibly far. Working quickly to establish their hide site before full daylight, Sarah and Bradley created a concealed position that provided a stable shooting platform while keeping them invisible from the target area. The specialized rifle required careful setup, with every component checked and adjusted to ensure optimal performance. The first challenge was confirming the exact range to the target. Using laser rangefinders and careful map analysis, they determined that the distance was 2,987 meters, just short of the 3,000-meter mark, but still at the extreme limit of the rifle's capabilities. At that range, the bullet would take more than 4 seconds to reach the target, and even slight environmental changes could cause significant deflection. Sarah began the methodical process of analyzing environmental conditions and calculating the adjustments needed to compensate for the extreme range. The altitude was 11,800 feet, where the thin air would affect both bullet flight and scope performance. The temperature was 15 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to impact powder burn rates and bullet velocity. Wind analysis was the most complex challenge. At a range of nearly 3,000 meters, the bullet would pass through multiple wind layers, each potentially moving at different speeds and directions. Sarah and Bradley used weather balloons and careful observation to map the wind conditions at various altitudes between their position and the target. I'm reading winds from a northwest at 8 to 12 miles per hour at our altitude, Bradley reported, studying his instruments. But there's a valley effect in the middle section that's creating variable conditions, and the wind at the target elevation appears to be lighter, but more unpredictable. The mathematics required to calculate the shot were staggering in their complexity. Sarah had to account for bullet drop over the extreme distance, wind drift at multiple altitudes, the curvature of the Earth over such a long range, temperature effects on ammunition performance, and even the Coriolis effect caused by the Earth's rotation. As morning progressed into afternoon, they observed normal activity around the target compound. Through their high-powered spotting scopes, they could see individuals moving between buildings and vehicles arriving with additional personnel. Intelligence radio intercepts confirmed that the terrorist meeting was taking place as planned. The critical moment came at 1,347 hours, when Khalid Rahman emerged from the main building and stood in a courtyard area that provided the clearest shot opportunity. Through her rifle scope, Sarah could barely make out the figure, even at maximum magnification. The target appeared as little more than a dark speck against the lighter-colored ground. Target identified in the main courtyard, Bradley reported, studying Rahman through the spotting scope. This is our best opportunity, but the wind conditions are marginal. I'm reading gusts up to 15 miles per hour in the middle section, and that could push the shot significantly off course. Sarah studied the target through her scope, making final adjustments to her sight settings based on the latest environmental readings. The shot would require perfect timing, precise calculations, and an enormous amount of skill and luck. At this range, the margin for error was essentially zero. Wind is settling slightly, Bradley observed, watching his instruments carefully. We've got maybe a 2-minute window where conditions look optimal. Sarah settled into her firing position, controlling her breathing and focusing on the tiny target visible through her scope. She had made thousands of shots during her career, but nothing had ever required this level of precision and concentration. The weight of the mission, the extreme technical challenges, and the knowledge that this might be the only opportunity to eliminate a major terrorist leader all combined to create pressure unlike anything she had ever experienced. The final wind reading showed conditions that were as good as they were likely to get. Sarah made her last scope adjustment, verified her holdover points, and began the breathing cycle that would culminate in the shot. Through her scope, she could see Rahman moving slowly in the courtyard, unaware that he was being observed from nearly 3 kilometers away. Sarah's finger found the trigger, and she began the slow, steady pressure that would release the shot. Her breathing stopped at the natural respiratory pause, her sight picture was perfect, and all her calculations had been double-checked. At 1,349 hours and 23 seconds, she squeezed the trigger. The rifle's recoil was immediate and familiar, but the wait for impact seemed to last forever. At 2,987 meters, the bullet would take 4.2 seconds to reach the target, traveling through constantly changing atmospheric conditions that could deflect it in any direction. Sarah maintained her sight picture, watching through the scope for any sign of impact. Bradley was counting down the seconds. 3, 4, impact. Through the spotting scope, Bradley could see the results immediately. The bullet had struck Rahman's center mass, eliminating one of the world's most wanted terrorists with a single, perfectly placed shot. The extreme range and challenging conditions have been overcome through preparation, skill, and precise execution. Target eliminated, Bradley reported over the radio, his voice filled with amazement and professional satisfaction. Confirmed hit at 2,987 meters. The shot would later be analyzed by military ballistics experts and found to be one of the longest confirmed sniper kills in military history. Under conditions that pushed equipment and human capabilities to their absolute limits, Sarah had achieved something that most experts had considered impossible. The extraction from their mountain position took place that night, with helicopters navigating treacherous terrain and unpredictable weather to reach their location. As Sarah packed her rifle and prepared to leave the remote observation post, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from a small Iowa farm to one of the most challenging shots ever attempted by a military sniper. The success of the 3,000-meter shot established Sarah's reputation as one of the finest precision marksmen in military history. But more than personal recognition, the mission had eliminated a terrorist leader responsible for planning attacks against innocent civilians worldwide. The technical achievement was remarkable, but the strategic impact was immeasurable. Back at base, word of the impossible shot spread quickly through military networks. The same soldiers who had once questioned whether a young woman from Iowa could handle the pressures of combat now spoke of her with genuine awe and respect. She had proven that excellence knows no boundaries of gender, background, or expectation. Sarah's deployment to Afghanistan concluded 3 months later, but her impact on military sniper doctrine and training would continue for years. Her techniques for extreme long-range shooting became part of advanced sniper curricula, and her story inspired a new generation of precision marksmen who understood that the impossible was simply another challenge to be overcome through dedication and skill. The small-town girl who had once practiced with a slingshot in her backyard had become a legend in the most elite circles of military special operations. Her journey from Millbrook, Iowa, to the mountains of Afghanistan prove that sometimes the most unlikely people achieve the most extraordinary things when they combine natural talent with unwavering determination and the opportunity to serve something greater than themselves.